Okay, everybody, hello. Hello, hello, welcome. I just have a few things to say. First of all, turn off your cell phones, please. Please, please, please. Turn them off so they don't ring in the middle of the talk. Then also, the Education Committee wants to thank Stan very much for doing this series, because we are delighted. So, and he doesn't want any more of an introduction, because you all know Stan, so here we go.
I think we have a couple of seats still around. In any event, thank you for coming this afternoon. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, we have a problem. Is this better? Okay. We're looking for a few more seats. There are a couple of, I think there are some of the green chairs over there available. Good afternoon. As the first anniversary of 9/11 approached, New York City thought it would be very appropriate to have a poem or a speech that focused on the violence and tragedy which had occurred and pointed us to the future. So they solicited poets and essayists and authors to come up with something that they thought would be appropriate. And after reviewing all of the submissions on the first anniversary of 9/11, they read the Gettysburg Address. So you're not alone in thinking that Lincoln has an impact even in the 21st century. What I propose to do in these next 4 lectures is to look at him as a person, insofar as we can look into any person. So I will not be focusing so much on battles, but how he dealt with those issues in his life that became crucial to our understanding of who we are as Americans and what our country really means. He was born in 1809 into what was then the frontier. Now, many of us think of the frontier as cowboys and Indians, but the frontier was Kentucky. It was a tiny little state. It had very few people, and most of them were farmers. His father was a farmer. His father was a failure at farming and moved the family repeatedly from Kentucky eventually to Indiana and then to Illinois. Lincoln's mother died when he was age 9. And luckily for him, his father went back to Kentucky because they were living in Indiana at the time and married a woman, Sarah Johnson, with 3 children. And she brought with her 2 indispensable things for Lincoln. The first was the only book they had, the King James Version of the Bible. And the second thing she brought with her was an understanding of Abe's unique personality. Now, he was a strong boy. He was 6'4", full grown, and he could split rails. We all know about Abe Lincoln, the rail splitter. But the one thing that separated him from all of his peers is he loved to read. He had what amounted to 1 year of formal education. Now, of course, when we think about school, we think of going to the building we went through in kindergarten and first grade, second, so on and so forth. But that was not what school was like then. School was episodic. It was done in the winter when the chores on the farm were not so great. And the school teacher was an itinerant person who happened to know how to read and write and might come by occasionally in the winter and gather the kids in a barn and teach them. So in the formal education that Lincoln had, that amounted to about 1 year of schooling. Later in life, he described his education in one word: deficient. But it wasn't, because he read. And when he read, and he said, when I read a book, I read it to the east, I read it to the west, I read it to the north, I read it to the south. And then he read it again. He had a phenomenal memory, a phenomenal capacity for absorbing information and ideas. So one might say, what did he read? Well, he absolutely read the Bible. He knew his Bible. Many stories would be told about coming back from Sunday church services at some local house where there was some passing by pastor, and him repeating to his friends word for word what the preacher had said. But he also read other things, and whenever he could get a book, beg or borrow, and usually a combination of both, he would read. He read Shakespeare. He read Parson Weems, who wrote the first biography of Washington, the biography in which we're told that Washington chopped down a cherry tree. But what he got from that is an understanding about what Washington and the other founders had done in creating a new nation based on certain ideas of liberty. But Lincoln didn't stop reading as he grew. In those days, there were no law schools. And when he decided to be a lawyer, he had to read books, law books. And he had to absorb what they said. And law, as today, in a different way, was very complicated. There were all kinds of forms, all kinds of pleadings, and he just devoured the books. He did not go to work in another lawyer's office. He just read and read and read and started practicing law. He didn't need a license to practice law at that time. He just started doing it, and he luckily got in to a couple of partnerships as a junior lawyer. But his education didn't end as he became an adult and even as he practiced law. Most of us think of Lincoln as a lawyer. Did you ever think of Lincoln as a philologist, a student of the art of language? Yet he was the one who gave 2 lectures in the 1830s on language. He loved geology. After his return in 1848 from the one term he served in Congress, he decided to buy a book, and this was when he was in his late 30s and early 40s, to take with him back to Illinois, to Springfield. So he bought himself Euclid and decided to teach himself geometry. He was therefore not simply well-read, he was widely read. You may recall that Darwin published The Origin of the Species in 1858. By 1860, he was a fan of Darwin and Herbert Spencer. He read poetry, read Emerson, read Wordsworth. He was sophisticated. He wasn't just this tall, gawky, country lawyer. He was a sophisticated. He was subtle. And so it came to the point where, after looking at his career and looking at his life, he began to think about those things that were most meaningful to him and the way that he would process information. So one of the reasons that Euclid was so appealing is that Lincoln processed information logically, rationally. Although, and we'll talk about this later on when we talk about, in the next lecture, Emancipation of following on Gettysburg, he was a spiritual person. Not religious, we'll talk about that later. But by the time he moved into adulthood, he already had the mental tools to move forward. He had, in his later career as an attorney, a junior partner, William Henry Herndon, who remarked that the little engine of ambition never ceased in Lincoln, that he was incredibly ambitious to grow out of the hardscrabble farming life that his father had lived, ambitious not simply to improve himself intellectually, but to improve himself financially, to secure for himself and his family financial security. And he was, of course, ambitious politically. But it was also apparent to his friends and family that there were parts of Lincoln that they would never know and they would never touch. He was the most sociable, amiable man. He told story after story after story, and humor, and particularly the kinds of humor that played up his own self-recognition. So once when a politician approached him and called him on account of reversing some political position, he said, "Mr. Lincoln, you're two-faced." And Abe turned to him and said, "If I was two-faced, do you think this would be the one I kept?" Think about that for just a moment. When was the last time we had a politician who could make fun of himself, who could recognize traits that were not the most fabulous? But he also had the secretive part of himself, the secretive place that nobody got access to. He had legions of really good friends and supporters. No one ever got to the inner Lincoln, with the perhaps exception of a couple of his children. And we don't know that. What he was persistent and determined in whatever task he undertook. He said, "I may be a slow walker, but when I take one step forward, I never go back. And that speaks to a great deal of his career, because a great deal of his career were failures. You know, Lincoln was elected president. He saved the Union. He freed the slaves. Incredible successes. But what about the failures? He failed when he opened a little store in New Salem, a little general store. We might call it sort of a super Wawa. He failed the first time he sought election to the state legislature. In the Black Hawk War, which was hardly any kind of a war, but the Illinois militia were called up. And in those days, militia elected their officers. So he was elected captain of the local Salem militia company. By the time the Black Hawk War was over, a couple of months later, never having seen his unit, never having seen combat, his rank was private. Now, I don't know those of you who were in the service, but I don't remember too many people going from captain to private. After he served one term in Congress, there was a rotation among the Whigs as to the number of people who would be available to run for the congressional seat in central Illinois, which the Whig Party could control. And his term was up. He looked for a job as the head of the land office for the United States with a new Whig president, Zachary Taylor, coming in. And he didn't get the job. We all know, or should know, have heard of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. But that was not the first time he ran for the U.S. Senate. He ran for the U.S. Senate in 1856. And guess what? He lost. And of course, he ran for the U.S. Senate against Douglas, and he lost. And if you think the failures existed only before he became president, what about his failures in picking his generals? One after another, he picked generals who fundamentally were incompetent. So when you talk about persistence, Lincoln said, when you get to the end of your rope, tie a knot and hold on. He wasn't going backwards. Lincoln was a politician. I said he lost his first attempt for office in the Illinois House of Representatives in 1832. He won a second attempt in 1834. And he became the leader of the Whigs in the Illinois State House of Representatives. Now, what is a Whig? Not W-I-G, but W-H-I-G. So there were two predominant theories of the way the government should function in the mid-19th century. The first was the Jeffersonian concept that the country was fundamentally agricultural, should stay agricultural, with lots of freehold farmers earning their living from the land. And commerce was not favored, to say the least. And whatever favored the farmer was the way we should go. The Whigs, basically founded by Lincoln's hero, Henry Clay, favored a more Hamiltonian kind of policy, a policy that favored internal improvements like canals and railroads and tariffs, which subsidized American industry, and a more active government. Not a government that does least, therefore can do least harm, but a government that encourages people by creating, to use the 21st century word, by creating infrastructure to support their effort to be the best that they could be, to become what Lincoln was becoming, a self-made man. So that the farmer now had a barge canal to send his goods to a further market, and he had more markets, and the government would protect the local steel maker who made the local plows for the farmer. And the Whigs favored, banks favored commerce. And he was a Whig politician. In the Illinois state legislature, he favored canals and railroads and subsidies for things like education. Central Illinois was one of the few congressional districts in Illinois that was Whig. And as I said, he was elected to Congress, and he served one term in the House of Representatives. And he accomplished essentially nothing. He was a lower in the rung of folks. He made friends, but he didn't get very much done in the way of getting things done. His term was up. He headed back to Springfield. And he took up again the practice of law. He became one of the most successful lawyers in the state of Illinois. He became one of the most successful lawyers in Illinois, not just by supporting poor farmers, but by representing railroads. And railroads were one of the most litigious kinds of companies in Illinois because nobody had seen railroads before. And so when a barge hit a railroad bridge because the water drifted over, who was at fault? Was it the barge company? Was it the bridge company? And Lincoln became the premier lawyer for the Illinois Central Railroad and began to develop wealth. And his focus in his life was on his career. He still was a politician in that he was involved with the Whig Party, and he promoted Whig candidates locally, statewide, and for president. But his focus was not on politics. His focus was not on the great issues of the day. And the great issues of the day circled around one fundamental issue: slavery. Now, we'll talk more about slavery next time, but politically, the country had faced in 1787 at the Constitutional Convention a crisis to determine how to keep the slave states, then particularly South Carolina and Georgia, in the Union, even though they were slaves. And as time went on and more slave states and free states joined the Union, but there were more conflicts, and a great compromise was reached in 1820. Remarkably, it was called the Compromise of 1820. And what it said was this: we're going to admit Missouri as a slave state, but the southern border of Missouri, as far as the Pacific Ocean, the rest of the Louisiana Purchase was going to come in as free states. That was the Compromise of 1820. And what it really meant when you think about it, and think now I'm going to ask you to think about the Senate. Each state in the Senate gets how many senators? 2. Well, if I have more states that are slave states, I get more votes in the Senate. Guess what? If I have more free states, I get more free state votes in the Senate. Eventually, the number of states becomes determinative of who's going to control the Senate, and with it, by population, who is going to control the House of Representatives. Of the first 10 presidents of the United States, 8 were slaveholders. So the government fundamentally had been oriented to support slave states. There was what was known as the federal consensus. That is to say, political leaders, North and South, had agreed on one fundamental proposition, that the federal government had no right, none at all, to control the domestic law of a state when it came to things like marriage or education or slavery. The federal government couldn't take and make a free state a slave state or a slave state a free state. That was up to the state. This was the federal consensus. This was the Compromise of 1820. Until the Mexican War. And with the Mexican War, something happened. The United States won the war and took what amounted to, today, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah, Colorado, into the United States. This was not contemplated by the Compromise of 1820. So what were we going to do with these territories? What were we going to do with the rest of the Louisiana Purchase, areas like Kansas and Nebraska and Colorado and Montana? But I'm using state names. They weren't given those names then. What were we going to do with them? How were we going to divide them up? One theory was called popular sovereignty. And its greatest advocate was a Democrat from the North, a Northern Democrat from Illinois. His name was Stephen A. Douglas, a great political figure. And he said, there's a simple answer to the question. We believe in democracy. What is the essence of democracy? The essence of democracy is that the people rule. The majority rules. So in these territories, let the settlers decide whether they were going to be slave or they were going to be free. It's not our business. And Douglas argued, I don't care if a state is slave, and I don't care if a state is free. I care about whether or not there was a fair, free vote determined by the people of that territory as to whether they would come into the Union slave or free. Now, Lincoln had prospered, as I said, as an attorney. And although he was involved in Whig politics in Illinois, it was at a local level. But he saw something in this concept of popular sovereignty that to him was a violation of the fundamental pledge made in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it wasn't sufficient, Lincoln argued. It was not sufficient to argue that we're going to let the territory's settlers vote in terms of a majority, because it was fundamentally a moral evil to vote for slavery. Lincoln, from his earliest upbringing, from the earliest memories he had, was always opposed to slavery. He took a couple of trips, barge trips, taking some goods down the Mississippi on behalf of a local merchant. And he saw the slave markets in New Orleans, and he was repelled. He wasn't repelled by just what he saw, but he was repelled by the idea that one person could control another human being. Part of that came from his biblical understanding. Do you recall in Genesis, after Adam ate the apple, and God is throwing Adam out of the Garden of Eden, what God says to Adam? In essence, he says, by the sweat of your brow, you will earn your bread. What that meant to Lincoln is, if I sweated and I earned my bread, you weren't entitled to it. Only I was entitled to it. Liberty only meant, it had to mean, that no man controls another man's labor, that I don't work as somebody subservient to you. And if you remember the Declaration, when Jefferson wrote that famous phrase, he called upon nature's God, who endowed us with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And Lincoln argued Douglas is wrong, because a majority vote cannot take away a person's natural right to liberty. He said it was sort of similar to two wolves and a sheep meeting together and going to have a vote about what was on that night's menu. His humor, not mine. So people are endowed by natural rights. There is a natural law that entitles us to liberty, and that was in the Declaration of Independence. Imagine the Declaration of Independence as a picture of our ideal as a country. And imagine the Constitution as a frame. The Constitution frames and gives structure to our accomplishment of our ideal. It doesn't defeat our ideal, and by itself, our ideal cannot function without structure. The problem was that the frame was partly broken, or as he said, half slave and half free, we cannot exist. We will end up either all slave or all free. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were a circus. There were 7 debates all around Illinois in small towns. And thousands of people came to these debates. It was like a festival. People then debated. Now, if you watch our presidential debates, they're a farce compared to this. The debates began with one speaker speaking for an hour, followed by his opponent for an hour and a half, and the first speaker having a half an hour rebuttal. Meanwhile, there were bands playing and banners waving and cheers, no microphones. What there were, which was interesting, there were stenographers who took down what was said. So we have pretty well a verbatim report of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858. And I said previously, Douglas won election. He won election even though Lincoln got more popular votes as a Whig. You need to recall, or I need to recall for you, that the election was not a direct election as we have today for senators. We had an election here in Pennsylvania a couple of months ago between Mr. Oz and Mr. Fetterman. You went to the ballot, you chose who you wanted. No, at that time, it was the state legislature who chose the senators. So you voted for the state legislator, and they picked the senators. And what had happened is Lincoln got more votes for the local Whig candidates, but because of gerrymandering, the Democrats got more representative seats, and they re-elected Stephen A. Douglas. And Lincoln was not shattered, that's too strong a word, but deeply hurt because he did not expect to lose. So popular sovereignty became the law. And Lincoln became popular. Remember that before the Lincoln-Douglas campaign, Lincoln was a local politician in central Illinois and a Whig. After the campaign, he was one of the most prominent, most eloquent of the new Republican Party, supporters of defeating popular sovereignty and insisting that there be a limit to new states, that they could no longer be slave states. So in the fall of 1859, the beginning of 1859, the spring, Lincoln began to travel around the North. He made speeches in different cities, in Cincinnati. His most famous speech was at the Cooper Union in New York. And I suggest to you, if you want to hear Lincoln's famous Cooper Union speech, you can get it on YouTube, where the gentleman's name, who was the actor on the Korean War movie about the doctors? What was his name? Right, Sam Waterston, I think. No, it wasn't Alan Alda. It was Alan Alda, but I think that the actor's name is Sam Waterston. You go on YouTube and type in Lincoln Cooper Union speech. And what had happened when he got to New York, at the Cooper Union, all of the New York power brokers were there. All of the Republicans who had anything to say, supporters of Seward, supporters of Salmon Chase. And what he did in that speech is almost a Euclidean demonstration of the falsehood that the founding fathers favored slavery. Not only did he make his name by the Lincoln-Douglas debates, but he so impressed the Republican figures in New York that he undercut his chief rival for the presidential nomination, Seward, in his own state. The Republican Party had been formed in 1856 out of the elements of the Whig Party, Northern Democrats who wanted slavery restricted and did not favor the Compromise of 1850, and abolitionists. There was a spectrum of political feeling about what could be done about slavery. The abolitionists, people like Wendell Phillips, people like Charles Sumner, people like Frederick Douglass, believed that the federal government had the authority to abolish slavery in the states. Nobody else believed that. The abolitionists believed that not only did you have to free the Negroes, frequently described with another N-word, which I will not use, but you had to grant them civil and political rights. They had to be freed and then equal. But the abolitionists were a fringe of a fringe, very vocal, but a fringe. But an element of the Republican Party. But the biggest elements of the Republican Party were the old Whigs and the Northern Democrats, who were more conservative, who only agreed that we can't allow slavery to spread. Well, after 1858, the South understood that the movement to the Republican Party meant that if a Republican was going to be elected president, a revolution was going to occur in the federal government. For the first time since John Quincy Adams and John Adams, there was going to be a person as president who found slavery morally repugnant and would do everything in his limited power to see that slavery would not spread and that new and free states would be admitted to the Union. So they had some choices. And those choices were based upon the idea that they had to act to defend their interest in slavery. And we'll talk more about slavery in the next week. But slavery represented in 1860 the largest single export of the United States, which was cotton. Slavery represented more wealth than all of the railroads, all of the banks, and all of the industrial enterprises of the North put together. So the Southerners, feeling that if slavery did not expand, it would be choked off, understood that the election of a Republican was going to mean a radical change against their way of life. Most Southerners, by the way, didn't own slaves. Hard to believe because almost all Southerners, with certain exceptions in certain states, came up and defended the Confederacy when it was formed. So the most likely opponent to the Republican nominee was going to be the Democratic nominee, who was going to be, he thought, Stephen A. Douglas. But the Southerners did not trust Douglas. So what happened is the Democratic Party split in two. In 1860, there were 4 candidates for election. There's a gentleman named Breckinridge, who represented what was called the Constitutional Party, Bell, who represented the southern wing of the Democratic Party, Stephen A. Douglas, who represented the northern wing of the Democratic Party, and Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was elected. He was elected with about 44% of the popular vote. Now, it could have been a little bit higher had the southern states put his name on the ballot. But his name was not on the ballot in any of the southern states. Hard to get votes that way. So the Southerners determined on secession. The election was in November, and in December, South Carolina purported to secede. Lincoln left Springfield, and the inauguration at that time was March 4th. So if you had a November election and the inauguration was in March, that meant you had months to go between the election and the new government coming into power. You'll recall that Franklin Roosevelt got a constitutional amendment passed, so we have our inauguration now, the 20th of January. But in those days, Lincoln took a trip from Springfield. He took a trip to Washington. And as he took that trip, more and more and more states seceded. So Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas. Approaching Washington, what Lincoln was approaching was the dissolution of the United States. He stopped in Philadelphia, among other stops. And he spoke at Independence Hall. And he made clear, as he had at each of the other stops, that he was going to take an oath to support and to defend the Constitution of the United States. And that oath meant to him that the Union had to be preserved. He said, "If I am told that I cannot defend that oath, I would rather be assassinated here on this spot." So he was faced with a different kind of dilemma than Washington was faced with. Washington was faced with, how do we preserve the right and the struggle for independence? And Lincoln was faced with, how do I preserve what has been created based on the best ideal of human liberty and human dignity, and do it within the confines of the Constitution? During the time the states seceded, or what they called seceded, most of the federal armories all around the South were taken over by the Confederates. The primary one that was not taken over by the Confederates was in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, Fort Sumter. I had occasion with Rita a few years ago to visit it. I was impressed in a way that when you get to physically see geography, it does something more than the books. Fort Sumter sat in the middle of the harbor. No ship could get in, no ship could get out if Fort Sumter was active and had its troops and its guns and its ammunition. It basically blockaded Charleston Harbor. And the federal troops, the United States troops, were in Fort Sumter in the middle of the island, and Lincoln tried to send in a ship with him. He said, he let the South Carolina governor know, it's only food that I'm sending in, no ammunition, come aboard the ship, inspect, I'm just sending food. And the South Carolina governor, in conjunction with the new president of the Confederate States, Jefferson Davis, said, no, we're not letting any United States ship come in. And the choice was then, as Lincoln wanted it to be, on the Confederates as to what to do next. And what they did is they bombarded Fort Sumter and began the catastrophe known as our Civil War. Thank you. Thank you very much. Remember, no intelligent questions, because most of these facts sort of leak out of my ears after a while. But seriously, please, if you have a question, don't hesitate. Yes?
Do you know if there was a time during Lincoln's life, particularly his political life, when he had a desire to become president?
Oh, yeah. Oh. When he re-entered the campaign in 1854 for the Senate, he was not small-minded in his ambition. Now, that didn't mean that he had expectations, but as his law partner Herndon said, that little engine of ambition within him was never stopping to pump. And when 1860 rolled around, I mean, he didn't make trips all over New England and New York talking to Republicans without the idea he wanted to run for president. Yes?
Why wasn't he put on the ballot in the South?
Why wasn't Lincoln put on the ballot in the South? I honestly cannot give you a specific answer, but I'm going to guess that they didn't want any votes for Lincoln in the South. He was going to be the enemy. Now, there were places in the South that were Union. For example, East Tennessee or more famously, Western Virginia. You may not be familiar with the fact that West Virginia broke off from Virginia in the Civil War and formed its own state because West Virginia was full of pro-union folks. So I can't give you, why didn't they do that? That's my best guess. Anybody else? Okay, so one final thing. For those of you who have missed some of my talks that you might want to see or see in the future, there's a very simple way to get it now. If you have a computer, go to YouTube and just type in Stan Siegel's talks. There is no password. So you go to YouTube, go on the line, Stan Siegel's talks. All of the talks are there. You can watch them or not. I would appreciate if each of you would watch them a couple of 100,000 times. And then I might get enough dollars to have free drinks on Wednesday. Oh, I meant Thursday. That's an incentive. So I just want you to know it's there. Goey's going to be there. It's for you. Feel free to use it anytime in any way you want. Yes?
I have a question, and my question is related. So I know this is one of 4 talks, but I'm going to jump ahead for 1 second.
Okay.
I'm curious to know, and I will not be here for the other talks, probably, so I'm going
to If you're not, you're penalized.
For everybody. I'll stand up. My question is, if Lincoln were not assassinated, what do you think, based on his persona, the things that you've researched, what do you think would have come of Lincoln after the end of the Civil War? Would he have served a second term? Would he have served maybe a third term? What do you think, and what do you think the impact on the country would have been?
Well, the speaker is Rita's son, Keith. He's not allowed to ask his father questions. He certainly would have served the second term. And we'll go into this in the last lecture, but he faced a dilemma in a way as deep as he faced with Fort Sumter. He had 2 fundamentally conflicting issues facing him. First, millions of Southerners had rebelled and fought a bloody war in which 600,000 Americans died, North and South, more than all of our other wars put together. The casualty total in 3 days at Gettysburg was 50,000. You talk about, and I don't mean to diminish in any respect what you saw in Afghanistan after 15 years of war. We lost, unfortunately and tragically, 25 men at 15 years of war. D-Day was 2,500. 9/11 was 2,500. In 3 days at Gettysburg, 50,000. Well, what do you do with the Confederates? What do you do to reconcile them? What do you do to conciliate them? Particularly in light of the fact that their land had been devastated. But if you're going to conciliate them, what do you do with 4 million freed black people who couldn't read and couldn't write by and large and owned no property? What do you do with them? How do you reconcile the legitimate needs of the newly freed and the conciliation with the former rebels? That's the issue he faced. And he tried in his last few years to begin a process of dealing with that. The final answer, or answer to Keith's question, you have to wait until my fourth talk. But the incentive for the fourth talk, the incentive, our trustees on our board of trustees have kept the price of tickets the same. Although I know one trustee would like to charge. Right, Mr. Cantor? Please, anybody else, any other questions? So I want to introduce you, oh, Dave, yeah.
Shout, I don't have a mic.
I think one thing that propelled Lincoln to the presidency was a very, very famous book we ought to all read and get for our library. It's called Lincoln's Last Trial.
I'm sorry, I'm having,
Lincoln's last trial.
Lincoln's Last Trial. A correspondent from a Chicago newspaper came to Springfield and covered the trial and wrote down all the testimony that was taking place. And somebody discovered that testimony a few years ago and turned it into the book Lincoln's Last Trial. It's a fascinating piece of literature. We ought to all read it. Not very long. And the guy who wrote it, his hand got so sore because transcribing. But he sent those notes through telegraph to Chicago, and it was went nationwide. So people learned about Lincoln's ability.
yeah, Lincoln, there's a story, it's probably apocryphal, that he was doing a trial before a jury. And most trials then were before juries. And any lawyers who have litigated know that when you're getting up before a jury, your first statement in presenting the case is crucial, because what you're trying to do is to win the jury over to believing in you and that you're telling the truth and it's important. So in this trial, he gets up and he says, reckon that I'll give the opponent credit for issue number 1. Reckon I'll give the opponent credit for issue number 2. Reckon I'll give the opponent number 3. Then it goes down the list, knowing full well that number 1, 2, 3 were meaningless until he gets to number 6 or number 17 or whatever it was. And then he lays into the other guy. And all of the jurors are saying, wow, he's a nice guy. He's making concession after concession. Oh my God. So he won the case. Another case, one thing I hope that comes from these 4 lectures is that you take a renewed interest in this incredible human being and pursue it a bit on your own. But in any event, in this case, 2 lawyers were walking down a hall, friends of his, and they see he's putting on a trial in a patent case on some machine or something like that. So he's got the machine on the floor. And he goes to the jury and he says, it's going to be a lot easier if you understand is come out of the jury box. Come on, let's get down on our hands and knees and I'll point out this gizmo and this one. And one lawyer standing out of the corridor says to the other lawyer, boy, he's got them on their hands and knees. He's going to win this hands down. He was a remarkable guy, really remarkable. I want to introduce my other son, Doug. Raise your hand. And I have 2 of my grandchildren here, Aaron, raise your hand, and Lily. And I have their mother here, too, as you know her. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. See you next week. Same price.